Awesome. Well, we have one more Sunday left in this series, How to Be Excellent at Life. And we're looking at this idea of wisdom. And as we look at situations and circumstances around us, there is some realities to those circumstances. And sometimes it is difficult to understand what is going on because we don't see the full picture. When we do some different things with our kids at times, and one of those things is this activity is, can you guess the picture? And what it does is it zooms in to a closer image of the picture, which is, this isn't working, guys, so if you can get that functioning for me. Are we frozen? There's a bit of uncertainty up there. I'll let them sort out what they're sorting out, and there we go. So it zooms into a closer image, a closer portion of the picture, and you've got to try and guess what it is. So let's just humor me for a moment this morning, and if you know what it is, and if you're one of those vocal kind of people, yell it on out. If you already know, shoot it. Then it zooms out to a further away. Anybody yet? Further away. Orange, yes. And there it comes, the orange. This one, a coconut. A horse. Someone said a horse. Anyone else? A cow, a dog, a horse. Once you see that hair, yes, yes, good job. Last one. Pastor Jeremy. He is not with us today. He is unwell, but I just wanted him to be part of the service. So here he is, Jeremy. When we can't see the entire picture, it becomes more difficult to understand what is taking place. But sometimes we get thrown a curveball. I saw this week, which really just sort of blew my mind. Would you believe me that this shape and this shape are the same color? Some of you might. Some of you might not, because you're looking at it going, you know what, the top one's grey and the bottom one's kind of like a white with a bit of a grey tint on it. They're not exactly the same color. But if I was to take a little circle out of this one, not change the color and move it down there, it's exactly the same color. I'll do it a little bit slower so you can see the color isn't changed, but it is exactly the same color. It's really bizarre. It doesn't make a whole lot of sense. In fact, if you hold your arm up and cover this section, so hold your arm up or your hand, cover this section, you'll see that both of them are the same color. Did anyone find that out? Anyone? You can squint an eye, just cover that section, you'll see they're both the dark grey. And what's different here is shading and shadowing. And as we look at life, sometimes we can see the entire picture. Sometimes we think, okay, this is making sense, I know what's going on, but then something jumps out and we realize, hey, it's not as it seems. In this case, it's light or shadowing that makes the difference. And in fact, light is something that helps reveal, but it's also something that creates shadows and shapes and distorts images from time to time. And I guess it further increases the complexity of this idea of seeing the bigger picture. When there's been times in my life where I would have really appreciated some more information in order to get a better understanding of the bigger picture. And in that, there's been seasons that I've asked a few questions, and those questions and those seasons tend to be around this idea of sorrow and suffering. So the moments where it really matters to us, where we're like, I just can't see what's going on. I'm looking at this situation. It doesn't make a lot of sense, and it's really bogging me down. And in that, those situations tend to be moments of sorrow and moments of suffering. As we continue to navigate life, I find myself asking some of these questions, and maybe you can resonate with them. Why is this happening? Why is this happening? And then something might have happened many years ago, and it becomes one of those things that's hard to let go. And we ask that, why did that happen? Anytime this situation comes back into your life, an opportunity maybe for a relationship or a new venture, because of that previous experience, it's greatly impacting your way of functioning today. And that question, why did that have to happen? Why did that have to happen? And this last question that I've asked a number of times of, what have I done to deserve this? What have I done to deserve this? Last night, as I was just looking over my message, I heard a nice sound that I don't love to hear. It's the sound of grinding metal. I knew that our car was parked out on the road. I went down and somebody quite pleasantly and joyfully has sideswiped our car and driven off. So that was one of those moments, right as I was looking over this point, actually, what did I have done to deserve this? And I don't know whether that was divine. God was just like, here you go, let's put it into practice and let's see if you can pull through on this. But there's things that happen of a greater nature that leave us needing to navigate suffering. So as we look at these different books over the last few weeks, I want to answer this question of how do I navigate suffering with excellence? How do you navigate suffering with excellence? We looked at different wisdom texts in the scripture, and there's three main wisdom texts. The first is from Proverbs, and the bottom line of Proverbs, the message of Proverbs is that practicing wisdom is the best practice. There's an enormous amount of wise sayings, great ways for us to do life and to do life well. And the bottom line of Proverbs is, if you do this, the likelihood, the chances are great for you to have this result. They are proverbs. They are things designed to help you practice life well. They are best practice. And in Ecclesiastes, we looked at just that confusion, that vapor, life is smoke, what's the point? And he's asking these questions. And he's sought for pleasure, and he's sought for different avenues to try and make sense of life. And he boils it down to fear God. And in all of that, the big idea of that was that we can profit most. So he talks about life being like a series of profit and losses. You know, like sometimes things are going well and sometimes they're not, and you just really struggle to make sense of it. And he says we can profit most by needing to make less sense of life. That's the big idea that he tries to get us to see. And today, as we conclude this series, the last of those three wisdom texts is this book called Job. It does read Job, but it's a O with a straight line across it. It's Job, the book of Job. So if you've ever seen that in the Word of God, you've already got a job, you might just flip over it. You might not understand what it's all about. But this is a really interesting book, the book of Job. And it answers a really big question. The question is, why do bad things happen to good people? I want to give you just a little bit of an idea of what the situation that Job was in was. There's 42 chapters in this book of Job, and it's a wisdom text. It's a book full of poems and people coming with their ideas and Job retorting their ideas. And here's the scenario. It starts with a little prelude that gives us a bit of a window into the beginnings of this. And what happens is we're transported to heaven, and there is a scene where God is there and Satan is there. And God says to Satan, "Where have you been?" He says, "I've been walking around looking and just observing things in the physical world." And in that, God says, "Well, have you considered my servant Job?" There was a conversation between people being righteous and people loving God, people serving God for right reasons. And God says, "Have you considered my servant Job?" And obviously Satan had, because he knew a bunch of things about him. He said, "You know what? You've got your hand on him. No one can touch him. He's got all of this stuff." And he was wealthy. He was a wealthy man. He had 10 children. He had servants. He had servants that he treated well. He had livestock. He had crops. He had all of these things. And Satan says, which Satan interestingly means the accuser. And I don't know if you've experienced things in the near past or in the greater past where you felt accused, ashamed, and that's what he is by definition. And in this state, he's doing it again. And he points out that Job is blessed, and if we were to touch those blessings, then he would curse you. He would turn away from you. And God says, "Well, okay, I'll go at it." And it's a really bizarre scenario. It's an odd situation. But Satan goes at it, and God says, "Do not touch Job." So Satan goes and wipes out all his livestock and wipes out his crops, and his barns burn to the ground. His servants all pass away, and then his children pass away. It's a devastating series of events. And still Job doesn't curse God. Still Job says, you know what, God's faithful, God's good. And it's like, wow. So Satan comes back to God and he says, well, you know what? If you let me touch him, then he'll break. And God says, okay, but don't kill him. So Satan goes down, and a series of things start to happen to Job. He breaks out in these boils. In fact, it describes it with bugs or worms crawling in and out of them. It's not a pretty sight. And he's scraping himself with a broken jar to try and clean the wounds. And he says that his bones are in pain. He's not in a good shape. This guy is really under a season of suffering. So that's the picture. And even in this conversation that was had, we don't really understand why God allowed this to happen. So then the passage continues, the scripture continues. I mean, it was an example of Job's ability to not turn from God because of the stuff God gives him. It gave example to that, but we don't really get that, the bigger picture. In fact, Job didn't get any of it. He just started to get these things coming across his life, and they were unpleasant. They were suffering, and he dealt with it excellently. So much so that he gets a mention and a commendation from God. So how can we do that? And in fact, the question that is asked in this book is a pretty big question. Why do bad things happen to good people? I'm sure we all want to know that. I know that I've struggled with that. I know that I've wrestled with that in my life. He has these three friends, Eliphaz, Bildad, and Zophar. And these three friends come along, and they start saying to him and trying to encourage him to start with. They start to try to encourage him, but then they start to try and make sense of it all. Whenever you're in suffering, whenever I'm in suffering, it's a default of us to try and make sense of it. Why is this happening? It must be happening for this reason. It must be happening for that reason. And these guys go down a path that points Job or paints Job to have had some hidden sin. They start saying to Job, there must be something you've done wrong for God to be judging you in this way. Job retorts and says, no, I can't, there just isn't. And there's this back and forth in the entire body of this text. And what we start to see is two things that we can do to navigate suffering poorly. So Job's presented with two opportunities to navigate suffering poorly, and we see the first of those in Job 3:3, and it says this, it says, let the day perish wherein I was born, and the night in which it was said, there is a man-child conceived. So when they said, it's a boy, he literally says, it would have been better if I was never born. This whole idea of giving up. And he gets to a point where he is presented with this overwhelming challenge and desire to just give up in the midst of that suffering. Yet he pushes through that. He pushes through that, and he was encouraged actually by his wife to do that. Just one chapter earlier, in chapter 2, she says, hey, Job, why don't you just curse God and die? I mean, that's some great encouragement from his wife. But that's what he got. In the midst of all of this, she comes to him and says, Job, you know what? Something's not right. You just need to give up. You just need to get out. And the second that we see in this idea of how to navigate it poorly is to blow up. To blow up. We can either give up or blow up. And Job was tempted in both of those instances. Even in his wife's statement, she tempted him to curse God, to blow up, to just let God have both barrels, curse God and die. So she encourages him to do both, to give up and to blow up. Job 18, in one of his retorts to his friends, or one of his friends' questions to him, they talk about Job and they say, you know what, you tear himself with anger. The picture here is he's tearing his hair out. They're saying, look at you, you're tearing your hair out. You're in a bad shape. They're just pointing out the obvious. And then in Job 20 verse 3, verse 2 even, it says this, Job 23, it says, even today is my complaint bitter. My stroke is heavier than my groaning. Oh, that I knew where I might find him, that I might come even to his seat. This is Job talking about God. He's saying, you know what, I'm really starting to get frustrated with all of this. I can't see why this is happening. I don't understand the bigger picture. In fact, what I can see looks horrendous. He says, you know what, I would like to just walk into the halls of heaven, to go straight up to the face of God and say, what are you thinking? What are you doing? And we see him struggling with this here, yet holding his faith. So tempted to blow up, yet not blowing up. And he says something here that reminds us that God is not always discernible, but he is always discerning. In verses 8 and 9, he says, behold, I go forward, but he's not there, and backward, but I cannot perceive him. On my left hand and on my right hand, he's looking, saying, God, where are you in this? So you can kind of get this point, you can kind of get this picture maybe that this guy is not in a good shape. He's lost a lot of things in his life. Some sorrow has set in, and then he's physically being tormented. And then in the midst of all of that, he's looking to his left, looking to his right, and saying, God, where are you? I wonder if there's anyone here this morning that's in that same place. God, where are you? Where are you? And then we come to God's answer to this question, to Job's questioning, to these back and forths between friends. And we find it in Job 38, and it starts like this. Then the Lord answered Job out of the whirlwind. The Lord answered Job out of the whirlwind. There's this picture of this big raging storm, which was very symbolic of Job's current feeling and situation. And I love the fact that it says that the Lord answered Job out of the whirlwind. And in this, he doesn't calm the storm, but he seeks to calm Job. And here's something that is true for all of us today. Sometimes God will calm the storm, and sometimes he'll calm me in the storm. We see stories and occasions of him with his disciples, with Christ with his disciples, and he would calm the seas. He would calm the storm. But then there is this scenario where he comes to Job and he seeks to calm Job in the midst of the storm. He then continues for chapter 38 through to 42. And this is it. Job is finally getting this conversation with God. I mean, I've had times in my life where I would have loved to have had a face-to-face discussion. And a lot of times it's around these areas of confusion. God, why is this happening? This doesn't seem fair. I'd really like to understand why this needs to take place. So then he starts to give explanation to this in Job 38 and through to Job 42. God answers him in a whirlwind, and he starts talking about the stars and the heavens and the galaxies and creation and the planets. And it just goes verse by verse of God displaying the complexities of the created world. Did you know that I found out today that scientists actually estimate for every grain of sand on Earth, there is 10,000 stars in the universe. For every grain of sand on Earth, there is 10,000 stars in the universe. I mean, this is complex. And here is Job in the midst of this messy situation, uncomfortable, unpleasant. And he finally gets a one-on-one conversation with God about why are these things happening? God, I want to know, I want to understand the picture. And God says, here is the picture. Look at this, look at that. Look at the complexities of how the sun rises and how the moon rises and how it continues in a way that pulls the tides, that does this, that does that. And then he starts explaining different parts of that creation, the mountain goats. And then he starts presenting this creature called the behemoth. He said, consider this behemoth. this almost like a mammoth-like creature. How mighty he is, how nobody can stick a ring in his nose and control him. He then takes him to the Leviathan, this picture of this big sort of sea creature, and says, the people's spears are just like sticks against this thing, and I've created this thing, I've made this thing. And it's like, okay, God, what are you trying to say? I'm asking this question as, why is all this happening? And God's answer to this question is literally this, that the picture is bigger than the problem. The picture is bigger than the problem is God's answer to why are bad things happening to me? Why is this happening, God? And he says, Job, I want you to look and consider all of this. I mean, one grain of sand is equivalent to 10,000 stars in the universe. This is a complex place. And as this is happening, something must have shifted in Job's mind for him to be in awe of his Creator. Because as we're going to see in just a moment, Job's posture and position changes. I want to give us three things real quickly this morning that we can do to navigate suffering with excellence. The first thing that Job did, that we see Job doing, is he expresses himself. In Job 23, which we read just a little bit earlier, where he's saying, I've looked to my left, I've looked to my right. He comes and says, you know what, I would like to just come up to God and ask him why. I'm in sorrow, I'm struggling with this. He actually doesn't hold this in. He expresses himself, and he does it in two different ways. He expresses himself to the right person. We see that there in verse 3 where he identifies it's the Lord, it's God that he's going to. He expresses himself to the right person, and he expresses himself within the bounds of right purpose. Chapter 23, verse 10, I'm just going to flick back to it. He says, but he knoweth, talking about God, Job's talking about God, he knoweth the way that I take. He's identifying that God, it may not always be discernible, but God's always discerning. God knows what's going on. He's saying this, I know that he knows the way that I take. And he says, when he hath tried me, I shall come forth as gold. He holds on to the purpose of God's perfecting and redeeming nature. He says, you know what? I understand that God understands, even when I don't. And he examines himself. Then we continue on. He expresses himself. We continue on to the second thing that he does is he examines himself. In Job 31, you start to see him getting to these end of his tether with these friends, going back and forth. Job 31, he then starts to think through things. He says, you know what, if my step hath turned out, verse 7, chapter 31, verse 7, if my step hath turned out of the way, and mine heart walketh after mine eyes, and if any blot hath cleaved to mine hands, he's saying, has my eyes been wandering, has my heart been wrong? Verse 13, if I despise the cause of my manservants or my maidservants, have I treated my servants poorly? I don't think I have. Verse 16, have I withheld the poor from their desire? Have I been unkind to the poor? Have I shown a lack of charity? No, I don't think I have. And he examines himself for 40 verses here. And I think as we navigate suffering, these are two great examples, two great steps of wisdom that we can see in the life of Job. He goes to the right person. He brings his frustrations to God. He expresses himself. He says, God, hey, I'm really struggling with this. I'd like to make sense of it, but he does it in a position of reverence. He does it to the right person, recognizing and believing for God's right purpose. He then examines himself. And the third thing that he does, which we see in chapter 42, the last chapter in Job, is he humbles himself. It says in verse 6 of chapter 42, wherefore I abhor myself and repent in dust and ashes. This is at the conclusion of God showing him all of these things and saying, hey, the picture is bigger than the problem. That's what I want you to know. I want you to know that I can't give to you the full comprehension, and for you to be able to comprehend it, it just isn't possible. But what I want to tell you is that I am in control. that I am sovereign. He's pointing this out, and Job has come to a point where he's like, you know what? I can see that, and I am going to humble myself. He falls to his knees in humble posture. As we think about this idea of justice, which is what he was seeking, and he was recognizing that God is a just God, and his friends, in fact, were saying, you know what, because God's just, if something bad happens to you, it must mean you've done something bad. Somewhat like the karma principle. But God actually nullifies, myth busts that in this passage. In fact, he points out the fact that that wasn't the case with Job. And part of Job discovering that was this step. He expresses himself, he examines himself. And whether or not you come to that point in the suffering that you're going through and in examining yourself, you realize, hey, there is something here that I need to work on. The next step remains the same. Humble yourself. Fall before God and allow him to shape, to mold you. If there isn't, then it's still the same. It's a fall before God and allow him to shape and to change and to mold you. But this idea of justice is to make right. The idea of justice is to make right. And that is what God is about and set about doing. He is making all things right. He is just. But when you consider justice, I want you to remember this morning that justice, in the process of justice, it's not just us. It's not just us. There's more to this picture. There's so much going on. There's principalities, there's powers, there's all of these things going on above us. There's all these things going on around us. There was in the States I know there's a bit of a phase at the moment on Netflix with some of these miniseries, but there was a man by the name of Gary Ridgway, and he was referred to as the Green River Killer. And this man was convicted of killing 49 people. So quite a prolific serial killer in the United States. And this man had a son, still has a son by the name of Matthew. And Matthew was young when his dad was arrested. And he said that he believed his dad to be a loving, supporting parent who never yelled at him, took him camping, bike rides, was present at his sporting games. This young boy knew this man to be his father and to be a great father. And if all the world was for Matthew Ridgway, then one day some law enforcement came along to enact justice, and they took his father away from him. And in his childlike state, not understanding the complexities of these things, his father had been taken from him. That is an injustice for Matthew. But we've got to understand that justice is not about just us. There is a bigger picture, and this man had to go through a process of justice. This man had to be removed from harming others. As justice was enacted, that took place. Yet, in the eyes of this young, innocent child, it seemed unjust. And in a way, God is trying to get us to see that, or not in a way, that is exactly what God is trying to get us to see in and through Job, that the picture is bigger than the problem. I'm going to ask the band to come this morning. And as they come, I just want to share with you something from my personal life. In my office, if you have been in there, and you're welcome to come in there, but I've got on the wall this picture of a whale, and I've got a few different whales in my office space. I love being out on the ocean, and one of the things that I get to experience out there in the winter months off our coast here is the whales jumping and playing, and it's incredible to watch the grandeur of these creatures. I like fishing, and I sometimes will look at that and go, man, that would be a nightmare to hook onto something like that. It would be unstoppable, like that Leviathan. Like God's pointing out, there's such grandeur to who he is. This time last year, we experienced some pretty devastating news in our family, and it resulted in change in leadership of our church. I became the pastor of a church, and it was a really difficult season. It was very difficult for many of you that understand and were part of that time. God brought us through that, bringing us through that. And then it was about November that the Lord blessed me with the opportunity to step in as the lead pastor here. And then in January, we thought, let's start the year on a little bit of a family holiday. My wife got sick. She went into hospital. And by January 15th, which was my birthday, I was diagnosed with COVID. COVID had finally come to Rockhampton, and I was one of the blessed recipients of it. And there I am. My wife's in hospital getting sicker. I've got COVID and am bound to the house. The kids start getting COVID. And then in the midst of that COVID, Alice calls and says, hey, this might be it. The doctors aren't able to turn things around. It's not looking good. I just want you to know that this might be it. They think it might be it. I couldn't go see her. I'm locked down in COVID lockdown. So I did what I knew to do. I reached out to you, the church, to others that I knew, and we prayed. And God began to turn that situation around, and the lovely lady's still with us today, and I'm so grateful for that. But then 1 month later, she was still in hospital for about a month. She got out, and then 1 month later, my grandmother checks into hospital with a surprise cancer that they had just discovered, and was in the very same bed that Alice had been in for months. So here we are back up again, visiting my grandmother in hospital. And I found myself, this is the first year stepping into this pastoral role, and I'm so excited about the future and all of these things. And then, God, why? What is going on? What have I done to deserve this? These sort of questions and stories. And in the midst of all of that, God gave me, through my wife, this passage in Jonah, where it talks about this story of Jonah, where Jonah, if you don't know who he was a prophet, a man that was proclaiming the good news of God. And in his story, he was thrown overboard. He was swallowed by a whale. It's a pretty crazy story, but nevertheless, Alice was reading through that and pointed me in that direction. I too read through it, and it said this phrase, that God prepared a whale. That God prepared a whale. Jonah was thrown overboard. A whale gave Jonah a trip to where Jonah was intended to be. And in fact, we know it would have been unpleasant, because when he was deposited on the island where he was supposed to be, it says that the people feared. They thought he was a ghost. So the whale had bleached him. It wouldn't have smelt good. It wouldn't have felt good. It just wouldn't have been a good experience. Yet, those words, God prepared a whale. God prepared a whale. The number of things that would have had to have lined up, tides, migration periods, mating seasons, all of those things that would have had to have lined up for at that one moment, that whale to be present as Jonah is landed in that place, in that time, is astronomical. Yet it says God prepared him a whale. And that just became a reminder and encouragement for me, and I stuck it on my wall, and every time I walk out, it's this door just here, every time I walk out it reminds me of two things. Jonah, if you, just a little recap on the story, Jonah ran away from God, that's why he ended up in the belly of a whale. So every time I walk out of that door it reminds me two things: don't run away, and two, God prepared a whale. No matter what you go through, Ben, is what God was saying to me, I've prepared it and I understand it. And he says to all of us today through this book of Job that the picture is bigger than the problem. And Mother Teresa was a lady that witnessed a lot of suffering and did a lot of social work in her life. And she made this statement, which I think is just a really powerful statement. She said, you'll never know if Jesus is all you need until Jesus is all you have. I wonder if you've ever been there. I have. Beginning of this year, I was there, and that night when Alice called me and I was sitting in our house just helpless, but hopeful. And I want to tell you this morning that you too can be helpless, but hopeful, because Jesus is an ever-present help in a time of need. He is a comforter, and you'll never know if Jesus is all you need until Jesus is all you have. In 2014, when we were in the midst of back and forthing to Brisbane for the original problems, Alice has brought a lot of problems to our life, but she's worth every single one. And in the middle of all of that, this is something I posted on Facebook. It came up yesterday as a memory, and I wrote this on Facebook saying, not being able to fully understand God is frustrating, but it is ridiculous for us to think that we have the right to limit God to something we are capable of comprehending. I love my Coke. If my brain was a Coke can, then God is the oceans. And it's just not possible to put that in there. And Job reminds us of that very thing. He says, you know what? The picture is bigger than the problem. You may be seeing something that's zoomed in. He's asking you this morning, zoom out. Zoom out. Know that I am sovereign. Know that I am good. And let's excel as we deal with suffering. Would you pray with me this morning? Father, we thank you that your hand is good, that your heart is good, that you think, Lord, your thoughts towards us are ones of restoration. We think about the idea of justice, God, and how you want to make things right. You want to make me right, God. You want to make us right. And in the process of that, it's not just us. As you enact your sovereign justice, God, help us to navigate that with excellence. And so wisely as Job navigated this, Lord, help us to do the same. Help us to express ourselves to you, to come to you as the source. Help us to examine ourselves, God. You're good at pointing these things out, but we're good at not coming and looking. And Lord, lastly, we need to humble ourselves, and that's another one that's on us. But you're faithful and just. You forgive us. You welcome us, and we thank you for that. You're good. You're good. We thank you in Jesus' name. Amen.